So let me open it up for questions, and please raise your hands, and I'll call it. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, my name is Simeon Lee, the PhD candidate in finance from University of South Carolina. All three papers are very interesting papers on a very important topic. And the question for the first paper is, does the result hold with the alternative definition of community banks? Because in literature, they have different definitions. And the suggestion for the third paper is that is fancy difference in difference method. I would suggest to see whether the effects differ over time, which is try to test the effects before the event and after the event. Use the fancy dynamic effects method documented in Beck and Lavin 2010 JF paper. Thanks.
All right. Thanks. That's a great question. Actually, one of the great benefits of coming to these conferences is you have thoughts of ways to improve your paper as you go along. So listening to paper descriptions yesterday, I realized that one of the flaws in this paper is that you're simply a community bank or you're not, based on the FDIC definition, which I love. The FDIC definition is great since it's based on what banks actually do rather than necessarily how big they are. But there are alternative definitions, right? So it would be useful to use what is a more standard definition, I think more people are familiar with, that is based purely on deposit size. Also, another way I want to do a robustness sort of check is banks that are $1 billion versus banks that are a couple $1 million may be different as well. And it may be worth trying to put them in separate bins and seeing if banks that are actually very, very small community banks versus the relatively large community banks are being differently affected by these macroeconomic factors. I haven't done that research yet, but I think it's worth pursuing.
Allison, the question.
Oh, I apologize. I missed that part. I'm sorry.
Question for Allison.
I would suggest to test the effects, whether the effects are different over time, which is test the effects before and after the event, use the Beck and Lavin dynamic effects method in JF 2010.
Yeah, so trying to get at some of the timing effects, like after Dodd-Frank, of when exactly does it happen. So yeah, we could definitely try to do that. So I didn't get into the sample size issues that we have. So we're not working with a ton of acquisitions just because we're focusing on acquisitions by banks between 5 billion and 16 billion. So in our whole sample, we've got about 260 acquisitions, and only a portion of those are after Dodd-Frank. But we can definitely try to look at, when exactly does the effect come in. But just based on just my casual, just looking at the data, I think it's relatively stable each year. So as banks are coming up to the 9 billion threshold, it seems as though then the incentives are going to be stronger. But we can definitely get some of that discussion into the paper. So thank you.
You can make a nice chart like in the back with you.
Yeah. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, who's got another question?
Yeah, in the middle.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Dave Hanrahan, Capital Bank of New Jersey. Jared, question for you. Mm-hmm. I noted on your chart 4, and perhaps somebody can bring that up, chart 4 in your paper, where you show the components of profitability, that since 2009, you noted interest rate spread as a positive contributor to profitability. And in practice, I feel like I've been fighting a stubbornly flat yield curve for the past, whatever it is, 8 years. Can you comment on that further, please?
To be honest, this is one of those things I wish no one asked me about. We're not really sure what's going on with the spread. I remember getting these results and being like, this is what the econometrics say it is, and passing around during all the other PhD economists in the room and going through and being like, well, this is what the numbers are kicking out. It seems to be implying that, yeah, with everything else being this huge drag, the spread was actually sort of a boost. I know it flies in the face of what people have anecdotally felt like they've been experiencing, and I don't know if that's simply a misperception on everyone's part or if it's a problem with the numbers themselves. I wish I had a better answer for you on that, though. I apologize.
Spirit of Texas Bank, Dean Bass. A question, just for Blake.
Run right into the microphone, please.
Oh, okay. Blake, question pertaining to the CRA guidance. Did you find that one number that fit all across the nation was correct? Or would you see that a detriment to certain regions that are performing well, and some that certainly needed that guidance? And did you find that that perhaps was more of a regional regulatory variance, or is that something that you saw worth a discussion?
So this is a question on the previous paper that I mentioned, not the current one. So I'll be brief since I was not on the panel, but we didn't actually test the effectiveness of the guidance in that paper. So there, you know, the site that I had in this presentation was actually from the FDIC losses, was from the, sort of the official OCC Federal Reserve, you know, review of what happened to CRE concentrated banks. So in that sense, you know, there's a significant threat to building up concentrations in any asset, not just CRE, but CRE tends to be particularly cyclical and risky. So what we did find in the other paper is that after the guidance, the banks that had built up concentration, so those over that 300% tier, you know, capital level, they actually moved into other asset classes. So it was effective at diversifying bank balance sheets in some way. And I think that's all I'll say about the effectiveness there.
I'm Destan Kırman, a second year PhD student in finance department, University of South Carolina. So I have one question regarding the third paper and one for the first paper. So for the third paper, for determining the 9 and 12 bin, can we try the regression discontinuity analysis to make sure that 9 and 12, I mean, around the threshold of $10 billion, it doesn't matter if it's 9 and 12. So, I mean, I expect to find an insignificant effect with the regression discontinuity analysis to maybe define 9 and 12 as a valid bin. And for the third paper, I'm going to ask if there is a feedback effect between the third and first paper. So what I mean is, so for the core profitability in chart 1, we have entry and exit, and also the competitive environment boxes, but so how can we see the mergers and acquisitions effect in this paper regarding the feedback effect from the third to 1?
So Allison, why don't you go first?
Yeah, so thanks for the question. So justifying the 9 and 12 billion has been something that, you know, right now we're just kind of making some arguments and we have some anecdotes, which is not necessarily the most convincing arguments. So we'd like to be able to do some kind of statistical test to validate those. So I think if I understood your suggestion would be to try and do a regression discontinuity using 9 billion as the discontinuity and one using 12 billion? Or were you suggesting using an RDD design around the 10 billion?
Yes, around 10 billion.
Okay, yeah, so that's something that we've definitely thought a lot about. So we don't do that here just because with an RDD, what you don't want is firms manipulating their behavior around the threshold, particularly if they can perfectly manipulate, because then you're getting back into the concern where you have a selection issue, where certain types of banks will manipulate down and some will manipulate up. And so that's actually exactly what we're trying to document. So in our view, the RDD design wouldn't actually get at the effect that we're looking at.
So even if it's a fuzzy one?
So, and I think part of it, so if we had tried to do a fuzzy design, we would need to get really close, I think, to the threshold. And this is, again, where the sample size issue becomes a problem, because if we had a lot of banks, I think we could still do that, because you could get close enough where it's, you know, even if all banks are trying to manipulate, as long as they can't perfectly manipulate, we could still use it. But because once you hone in on the 10 billion threshold very closely, you're dealing with so few banks that we just can't do it. But yeah, but thank you for the suggestion. We'd love to be able to do something with that.
All right, great. Not sure let me try to remember what the question was.
What about mergers? What is the effect?
Got it. Okay, so one thing I didn't mention because it's slightly more technical and I didn't know how many people really wanted to hear it. One of the standout parts of this paper is actually how it addresses attrition, which is involved in mergers and acquisitions. The problem, you can imagine it this way. So I'm trying to estimate what the effect or how strong these macroeconomic impulses are, right? You can just imagine it like somebody throwing a baseball, right? here you might have a baseball field that has a giant green wall or something, where if I throw the baseball, no matter how hard I throw it, it's going to hit that wall. And so every time I throw it hard enough to hit the wall, it's going to stop there, no matter how hard I throw it beyond that. If there's no giant green wall, you can see exactly how hard I threw that ball every single time by how far the ball went. All right? Mergers and acquisitions have this issue in the data that anytime a baseball, your bank, gets hit really hard by a macroeconomic shock, that baseball bat, that wall is going to cause this cutoff point where I don't get to see how much farther you could have gone. Either you got hit so hard that you went out of the park and you became a huge bank and you're no longer a community bank, so you're out of my data set, or you got hit so hard you went straight into the ground and you bottomed out and you disappeared from the data set because somebody else bought you or you just failed utterly. It doesn't apply to y'all here, but definitely to a number of banks who probably wish they were here, that applies. Right? It's because of that I can't see how hard that ball was hit. So there is a statistical process I can do, a Heckman selection process that I apply in a first step that accounts for all that. And then in the second stage that you actually see the results for, you can see how hard the ball was actually hit regardless of whether it hit that wall or got driven into the ground. It's kind of a cool econometric thing. And the short answer for you, for all those who didn't really care about that explanation, is that it only amounts to about 10 basis points in the most extreme. I think in 1 year, I can't remember exactly which year, it was about 13 basis points of difference in observed industry-wide ROA versus what would have been there had there not been all of this attrition effect one way or the other. But in most years, it was on the scale of 2 to 3 basis points. So it seems that mergers and acquisitions aren't generally that huge of an effect on how the industry is doing as a whole. That's my short answer.
Raise your hands high so I can see it. Yeah, go ahead.
My name is Jin Tsai. I'm a PhD student from University of South Carolina. I have two comments to the third question for Allison. So the first comment is kind of a clarifying question. So to test the acquisition activities, you use a treatment group in 9 to 12 billions. And to test the deposit, the treatment group you use is below 9 billions. Is that correct?
8 billion.
So it's 8 to 10 billion for the deposits. Yes.
Yeah. So I just wonder, have you tried on the same treatment group for both acquisition activities and deposit growth?
So you mean like just focusing on like 9 to 10, or
maybe 9 to 10, or yeah, 9 to 10, just on the same treatment group and test the two sides of the test.
Yeah, so as far as the treatment group definition, so with the deposit test where we're including 8 to 10, so there's going to be some banks that are just below the threshold that are going to choose to slow down their growth and stay below the threshold. And then there's some that are going to be, I'll say it one more time just so it's beaten into everybody's head, like Kevin's bank, and are going to choose to catapult over the threshold. So we can, it's hard for us to determine that ex ante. So we're taking kind of an easy way out, I guess, and we're classifying just the 9 to 10 group as both staying small, potentially staying small and potentially growing. But we're not arguing that the same bank is going to be slowing deposit growth and engaging in an acquisition. There's going to be different groups in each of those.
I said just curious what the results would be. And a second comment is actually related to this question, maybe a question for future study. Is that possible we can look at the banks who choose to increase acquisition activities and banks who choose to slow growth to avoid the cost, and say what determines why bank make these particular decisions?
Yeah, I think that would be really interesting to look at. And so that's actually something that is on our to-do list. So we're in the review process with this paper right now, and that's one thing that our referee has suggested, which I think is a great point. So I'll say that that's also something that we're going to try to examine, and then also just seeing if there's any systematic differences between those two. So thank you.
Hi. I'm Jim Kish with the Sumsic Savings Bank.
Right to the microphone, because I can't hear you on the web.
Oh, you can't hear me. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Jim Kish with Sumsic Savings Bank. I've got a question for Allison. Allison, great paper. All of them were great. The research was terrific. You know, looking at the compliance costs, one of the things I wanted to see as you were putting together your hypothesis around escalation of compliance costs around that threshold, did you look at any of operating costs, performance ratios, efficiency ratio, assets per employee? And it would probably start around 9 billion. And I only want to say this so I can say like Kevin's bank.
That's right.
And then probably 10, 11, maybe 12 billion, and see if there was actually an impact. And one of the things that efficiency ratio would do is isolate the operating overhead from the impact of revenue from the Durbin Amendment.
Yes, we've definitely thought about trying to see how much these ratios were affected. So it's difficult when the bank is actually engaging in an acquisition because you've got, so there's the effect of crossing the threshold and these compliance costs, the Durbin, well, I guess the compliance costs are coming before, but at least the Durbin Amendment that's coming in. And then you've also got the effects of the merger, and then you've got the effects of hopefully the bank is going to be offsetting some of that. So we'd like to be able to disentangle all of that. So we'd like to know, well, here's the effect of the Durbin Amendment, here's the effect of the bank engaging in the acquisition, and then here's the bump that they get in hopefully income from engaging in the acquisition. So with the acquisition observations that we have, that's all just going to be lumped together. But what we could try to do, and our sample size is going to be more limited because there's very few banks that seem to grow organically across the threshold, but we could at least try to look at the performance in the different buckets. So in 10, 11, 12, if you have been engaging in an acquisition versus not. So we'll have to try to make some adjustment for the direct cost of the acquisition, but I think that's something that we could try to get at. So would that help with your question? Okay, great.
Okay, who else?
Down here.
Oh, okay, sorry, it's hard to see.
Hi, Robin Prager at the Federal Reserve Board. So I have a question for Kevin and perhaps for other bankers in the room with regard to the Durbin Amendment. So back in the early days when the regulations were being introduced for the Durbin Amendment, we heard a lot of lobbying that where people were saying the Durbin Amendment was going to hurt community banks. That yeah, it says it's for the over 10 billion, but in fact it's going to hurt the smaller banks, and there's going to be this some sort of spillover effect. And I'm just curious. Like, it sounds like you really found there was this relevant threshold. Did the Durbin Amendment
spill over when I was young, when we were littler?
Before you hit that $10 billion, or did other banks feel that effect, or was that just something that really was never going to happen?
We never felt the effect before. And one thing when they do the paper, because you're talking about when the Durbin Amendment might hit, there's a delay on it, because we're not actually going to lose income until next July. So it's like a year. So just got to give you that heads up so you don't fall into the trap that you think that the ratio is going to change.
Okay, maybe one more. Good, Todd.
Hello, Todd Vermillier from the Federal Reserve, and it's a question for Jared and maybe for bankers as well. So you had a pretty optimistic take on the current performance of the community banking industry, but at the same time, we're not seeing much in the way of new bank formations. How do you reconcile those two facts? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I'll be honest here, I'm out of my depth on why they're not coming in. It's one of those questions that in the paper, like there's a short paragraph devoted to it, like, hey, there were lots of entrants up until the Great Recession, and then there has been, what, 1 or 2 since?
Well, there were 2 for the first 5 years. Now there's a few.
Okay, yeah. So there's a handful that have happened since. To be honest, I suspect it has a lot more to do with perceptions of the economy. This is just me speaking from my own ideas now. I don't know, talking to people on the street, you get the feeling that a lot of people are convinced the economy is still really terrible and there isn't a lot of oomph to it. And I wonder if that bleeds over and makes people less willing to start new businesses, start new banks. The data don't support that there's any reason there shouldn't be, right? Like the data show that there should definitely be new banks forming, and they're not there. So it's a whole research question in and of itself, I think.
Okay, let's have one round of applause for the all the participants.